So I've spent a few weeks now with three of the newest, hottest gaming monitors on the market. The 360Hz 1080p TN from Zowie, the 360Hz 1440p IPS from Asus, and the 240Hz 1440p OLED from LG. By now, I figure most people watching this video have consumed various deep dive videos of these monitors. I've spent the past few weeks upgrading the testing capabilities here at the studio, so we will have objective data going forward. And of course, I'll still be giving you my subjective opinion about some of the more important or controversial things you may have heard about these displays. Initially, a few months back, Zowie sent the XL2566K. I really enjoyed it. I mained it for a long time, and I was nearly finished with that review when Asus sent their PG27AQN. 27-inch flat, 1440p, 360Hz IPS is pretty much my dream format, so that changed a lot of the conversation about the Zowie for me and dulled some of the enthusiasm I had for that panel. Then, just as I'm getting my thoughts together about those two monitors, LG comes in with the 240Hz 1440p OLED, and I quickly rushed out and bought it. With Asus getting ready to drop their 240Hz 1440p OLED, I had to get this video out before that conversation potentially changes one more time. So the XL2566K from Zowie comes in at $599 US. That's a full $400 less than the LG and $450 less than the Asus. And the specs support that too, as the Zowie is a 24.5-inch 1080p versus 27-inch 1440p on the other two. That kind of begs the question, what's the point in comparing a display like that to these two other displays that cost significantly more? That's totally valid, but here's how I see it. One, this panel is aimed squarely at competitive FPS gamers, and honestly, it caters to them really well. The stand is fully articulating, it's got markers so you can recall your adjustments really quick, it has a very small footprint on the desk so you can move it really close to you without it getting in the way of your mouse pad or your keyboard. It's got a carry handle, side blinders, and a dust cover. And it has the puck. It's like a wired remote. They call it the S switch, and obviously it allows you to access your settings, but more importantly, it allows you to switch between 3 different presets on the fly without going into the menu. It also gives you the ability to store all your color profiles and your settings on the puck itself, and then you can use those with any compatible Zowie monitor. So if you're going to a LAN or a competition, you just bring the puck with you, plug it in, and all your settings are right there ready to go. The design's also kind of nice if you do travel with your whole monitor, because the power supply is inside the monitor itself, which means all you need is just a generic 3-prong power cable. There's no external brick to lug around like with the other two. Two, it just performs really well. It's 360 Hz, obviously, so it's really fast, and it uses Diac Plus, which is Zowie's own version of backlight strobing to help reduce motion blur. If you've never used Diac before, it is safe to say it's a cut above other implementations of this. The motion is just crazy clear on this panel. And that's a big reason why they opted to stay with TN on this release, because it plays really nice with that Diac technology. There's a lot of people out there that say $600 is too much to spend on a TN panel in 2023, but you really have to consider the specialized use of this monitor. This is not a well-rounded do-everything monitor. This is specifically aimed at getting the clearest, fastest performance you can for first-person shooters. Once you experience in person the cumulative effect of all the display tech working together here, and you don't just look at paper specs, I don't feel like it's priced too high for what's on offer here. To test the colors, I'd have to get outside my comfort zone a bit, because I mainly play COD, and its color palette is mainly mud and sand and stone and rocks. Not exactly eye-popping stuff. And the colors are better than most TN panels I've seen, I'll give them that, but overall they're still gonna be flatter and less dynamic than VA or IPS or especially OLED. But Diac is the star of the show here, and it's just crazy good. Normally we see this tech greatly decrease the overall brightness of a monitor, sometimes to the degree of not being usable for me. Standard brightness here is 357 nits with Diac off. It goes down to about 330 on high, and on my panel moving to premium doesn't cost any additional brightness. So that's why I opted to include this display in a video with two panels that cost significantly more. It says something to me that the speed and clarity of that panel keep it in the conversation here. The other two don't have any sort of tech comparable to Diac, and we are at 360 Hz here, while the LG OLED is at 240. You do have the option to disable Diac and use FreeSync Premium as your variable refresh rate. This comes in handy because most of your AAA single-player games are not going to run close to 360 Hz. There are a couple really important, potentially gotcha things that I don't hear a lot of people talk about with this panel. Number one, there's no HDR support at all, regardless of platform. And number two, if you're using this on a console, the variable refresh rate doesn't work. No PlayStation, no Xbox. If you're purely a sweaty, competitive player, you may not need to spend more money than this. If you put a big priority on motion clarity, this is the one, but it's not going to be a recommendation for somebody needing a more well-rounded gaming panel. So naturally, the PG27AQN got my attention immediately because it's 360 Hz, 1440p, and a new ultra-fast IPS panel. That's got 3 key features over standard IPS, including a new dual-layer voltage driver that draws the screen from 2 corners instead of 1, so the response time should be very good. Finally, I thought I'd be able to just have one monitor on my gaming desk for both competitive FPS and for casual gaming because honestly, 25-inch 1080p TN doesn't really hit for me on games that have crazy visuals, but I like the format for competitive. So I was really happy to see that they included an esports mode here where it reduces the displayed image to 24.5 inches, and you can use either 1080p or 1332p. That's a weird number, but the scaling looks much better than 1080p because the pixels per inch math doesn't work out great when you're going from 1440 to 1080. And it did actually work out that way. I do feel like I can just use one monitor on my desk, but not because of the esports dual mode. I tried it a couple times and it really doesn't feel like anything I'd ever use. Assuming you're on at least a 3070, it doesn't really tax the GPU that hard to run at 1440p versus 1080p in most competitive titles, and that performance delta is minimized even further at 1332p. Personally, whatever motor memory I'd learned being on that form factor for the better part of a year wasn't really an issue. I adjusted super fast and I liked the increased detail at 1440p, particularly in something like COD where it's hard to pick out small targets at a distance. After all, that's really why you're looking at this panel, is to get 1440p 360 Hz at 27 inches. That's the big draw, and it looks really, really good here. Unsurprisingly, the colors here are very good, even right out of the box, with no tweaking the settings and no calibration. The white point here is solid, and the default mode right out of the box, the colors don't look unnatural or oversaturated at all. It also has a wide gamut color mode for 98% DCI-P3 coverage. That offers a much more vibrant color experience that I prefer when I'm gaming. Gotta say too, this panel gets super bright. Max brightness in SDR mode comes in at a crazy 465 nits. That means you can use this panel in pretty much any ambient room lighting situation and you're not gonna have any issues at all. But none of that stuff really matters if you've got bad ghosting or motion blur issues, or if the panel itself just doesn't feel fast when you're playing, and I can tell you, you're not gonna have a problem with any of that here. This feels as fast in gameplay as the Zowie. Diac does beat it out purely in terms of motion clarity by a pretty decent margin when you capture a screenshot of a test like this, but in actual gameplay, the difference is not that noticeable. Not enough, in my opinion, to trade off for the excellent colors that you get on the IPS. This panel doesn't have any kind of backlight strobing tech to compete with Diac. What you get here instead is G-Sync for variable refresh rate. Variable refresh rate and backlight strobing generally don't play well together. You can't use them at the same time. But if I had to pick one or the other on a display that's intended for more than just competitive FPS, I'm glad we got G-Sync. Not every competitive game, particularly COD and Apex, are always gonna dime out at a clean 360 Hz. And no shot those big AAA single player games will either, so it's nice to have the variable refresh rate. If you are super into peripherals and input latency stuff, this monitor also has NVIDIA Reflex tech that can help you tune for lower system latency or see if any new peripheral is adding undue latency into your system chain. The contrast ratio here is 1,000 to 1, and that's pretty standard for IPS panels. You're just not going to get as high as you would see in something like a VA or the infinite contrast ratio of OLED, which we'll talk about more in just a sec. If there is one area where this monitor doesn't absolutely dominate, it is in that contrast ratio and its HDR support. It's listed as HDR 600, but it's an edge-lit panel like we talked about way back with the Sony M9 review. The HDR performance here is high-mid at best, as HDR really hits when it's able to display something really bright next to something really dark with no halos. With a dimming zone count of 32 here, while you do get some serious brightness increases, the blacks don't get as low as you'd like for HDR. You can actually see these zones as vertical bands lighting as you move a white mouse cursor over a solid black background. You do get some IPS glow here as well. Left and right side are both lit pretty heavy in the top right corner on mine, but in actual use, it just doesn't bother me. Particularly if you're not really gonna use this panel for HDR, just go in the menu and completely disable the variable backlight and you're good. I am disappointed to see HDMI 2.0 here. This means you're capped at 1440p 144 Hz over HDMI with the single display port offering the full 360. Current gen consoles are only pushing 120 FPS and HDMI 2.0 will do that, but monitors are one of those things you have for a while versus internal components or peripherals, so it would be nice to have some element of future-proofing baked in. Also gotta point out that there is a cooling fan in this monitor and it can be audible, but it requires the really odd combo of pushing the monitor really hard and it being dead quiet in the room, so it's not really an issue for me. Outside of that, my only wish for this panel is that it just got about like 2 inches taller on its native stand. Yeah, it's expensive at $1,049, but it's really, really good. While it lags behind others purely in HDR performance, it by no stretch looks poor for media consumption. It's a very solid panel for competitive and single-player gaming, and the colors are accurate enough to where you could use it for content creation. Obviously, I'm a fan of the PG27AQN, but then the LG 27-inch 240Hz OLED dropped out of nowhere. People started raving about it, so I bought one as fast as I could because I'm no stranger to how impressive OLED can be. And I have a real love-hate relationship with this panel. I don't want to get into what OLED is as a technology in this video. The main thing you need to understand is that there is no backlight. Each pixel lights independently, so when something is off, it's black, like pitch black. It's not some degree of gray. This means you get infinite contrast, and it's tough to verbally articulate what this does to an image. You may have heard people say that this looks 3D, or that it looks like a 4K panel instead of 1440, or it looks like you could reach your arm right into the image. All this stuff is absolutely true. The factory colors are off by a decent margin. They're too cool or too blue. It's easy enough to fix in settings. But when you see it sitting right next to the Asus AQN panel, it becomes clear that OLED is just another level. The other thing this does is it provides crazy low response times. The other two panels are already very low at around 1.5 milliseconds, but this is a staggering 0.1 millisecond gray to gray average response. That's even lower than they claim, and because it's not an LCD technology, there's no overdrive modes here to balance out, so overshoot is also very low. Just based on those two stats alone, an impressive visual image and impossibly low response times, you'd think there wouldn't really be much conversation about which one is king of the hill. On paper, aside from the obvious 240 versus 360, this should just be the best gaming monitor. In practice though, the motion blur tests are actually pretty similar to the PG27AQN, and neither have the same level of clarity as the Zowie. It's obvious that the lower response times are doing something though, as Ali over at Optimum Tech was able to showcase the difference via ultra slow motion footage, and I think he said it perfectly. The OLED feels more clear frame by frame, where the AQN feels smoother at 360 Hz. It's going to be really interesting when OLED panels start dropping that can hit 360. OLED panels usually just own at HDR because you can have a completely black pixel next to a fully lit white pixel with no spillage or halos or banding or anything, just infinite deep blacks and a really impressive dynamic range. But even in 2023, HDR performance on the PC is still really hit or miss. Games that are really well optimized for it, like Doom Eternal, look great. Others, like COD, simply look brighter but flatter and more washed, like the contrast has been sucked out of the frame. Console HDR looks very good. But, and you probably already know what I'm gonna say, the brightness. Just as I was immediately impressed with the clarity and the contrast of the image, I was immediately disappointed when I went to crank up the brightness and found out it was already at 100%, and it just wasn't there. The measurement of the brightness level is objective, but whether or not it's gonna bother you is subjective. So I've heard a few different takes on this. Some people say it's totally fine. Some people say it's totally fine as long as you're not in a bright room or you're not facing direct sunlight. And some people say it's a complete no-go. For me, it's a no-go. The first time I loaded into a COD lobby, I was running around the map and the whole screen just went gray. I thought there was something wrong with the panel, but it turned out that was a flashbang, a medium gray flashbang. So I dove into the settings, most of which are handled by a remote, which I'm not super crazy about, and disabled any power saving or anything that looked like it was gonna limit or vary the brightness. That helped a little, but playing COD, I still wanted this panel to be about 25% brighter all the time. Checking out some other titles, it seemed to fare better in Apex, where I would have settled for more like a 10 to 15% brightness increase. Again, it becomes really clear when you have the AQN sitting right beside this panel. The LG ships from the factory at 100% brightness. The Asus ships at 42% brightness, and they're within 40 nits of each other. They look very similar. And the monitor ships with the white point set to 8500K, and it's got a brightness of only 193 nits, but the colors look way too cool. If you go in and correct the colors to get the white point closer to that 6500K, you see a slight decrease to 188 nits. Now there are a couple picture options here that provide brightness as high as like 375 nits, but the colors here are even less accurate than the factory setting. And the major thing is that these modes disable DAS or direct action sync, and that's gonna result in some dramatic increases to input latency, so I don't recommend it. I tried it with a lot of different light levels in the room, but it's enough to be consistently annoying the entire time I'm playing. Like in COD, I couldn't even pick out guys from the background on some maps, and that's not something you want from your new $1,000 monitor. This is subjective, and it does vary by title, but it's enough to where I really don't have any interest in keeping this monitor. Sadly, it's way past the return window, so I just own it now. Those of you out there that normally play with your monitor set to a reduced brightness probably aren't going to be bothered by this too much, given the amount of things that this monitor does really right. I should mention that we have a different sub-pixel layout here, which makes some text and some graphical elements not as sharp as the regular RGB layout, but this isn't a huge thing for me personally. I don't think this is a deal breaker. It's just something to point out, and probably, again, not something you want on your $1,000 monitor. The other big issue with OLED is the potential for burn-in or image retention, especially from static elements on your screen, like a HUD in a game you play for hours on end, or the toolbar at the bottom of your Windows desktop. This is a 48-inch LG OLED TV, a CX. I've used this for about a year and a half exclusively as my main editing monitor, and I've logged countless hours on it. It doesn't have any burn-in. It's got a pixel cleaning routine that runs when you shut it down, and so far, I haven't had any issues with it, and truth told, I'm not particularly careful with it. That's not to say it's not gonna happen, it almost certainly will. It just hasn't happened yet. This monitor has the same maintenance tech in a separate menu, and it also cleans when you power it off. The issue here is that, again, people usually have their monitors for a long time versus their peripherals or their components. The warranty on this monitor in North America is only 2 years, which curiously is 1 year longer than their OLED TVs, where the Zowie and the Asus that we're looking at today have warranties for 3 years, but Asus has some fine print in its warranty agreement that says their OLED stuff is only good for 2 years. So that's a risk that you have to weigh in when you're buying something that costs $1,000. At this point, no reviewer can tell you how long these are gonna go before they start to burn in, but if I had to guess, I would say it was probably a little over 2 years. I've also heard a lot about the choice to go with a matte screen coating instead of glossy, and while I get that glossy makes for a more clear image, referring back to my 48-inch LG, which previously faced a window, that was no fun at all. And now there's only natural light on one side of it, and it's still basically a large black mirror. Honestly, I feel like the decision to combat reflections with this coating outweighs any potential knock to the visual presentation because, again, this panel looks outstanding. We also get HDMI 2.1 on both the HDMI ports here, so you can achieve 240 Hz in every hole. I like that. All resolution and FPS options are unlocked for console use as well, both on PS5 and on Xbox. The stand also gets like a full 2 inches taller than the Asus as well, and as a tall guy, I like that a lot too. Don't get me wrong, there is a lot to like here. The brightness is the deal breaker for me, and it's bad enough that I can't comfortably recommend this to a large audience. My copy also has this weird firmware bug where it tries to go to 4K 120 Hz. It doesn't happen all the time, like it doesn't happen in COD, but it definitely happens in Apex, and it definitely happens on the consoles. So the Asus OLED is right around the corner, and my copy should be arriving about the time you finish watching this video. As of today, right now, my picks are pretty simple. If you're purely competitive and more budget limited, the Zowie is very solid. For a more well-rounded gaming experience and even content creation, the PG27AQN takes it for me, and comes away with the Golden Beard Award as the current monitor to beat. Not only is it a stellar all-round performer, but it's based on IPS technology. That's something we know really well, so we have a better understanding of how this is gonna age long-term. If you got some value out of this video today, and I sincerely hope you did, hit that like button and that subscribe button. And if you want to talk shop about any of this stuff, the best place to do that is in my private Discord. I will link that down in the description. Up next is probably the Odyssey Maxwell, and then I'll be right back with that LG OLED panel. That's it for today. I will catch you all in the next one. Stay up.